Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming here. It's a really special day. 90 years ago today, this great commission was formed. I don't know if Joe Kennedy, who is the first chair, and his fellow commissioners said these words, but I know there are many commissioners here who will recognize the following words. I'd like to note that my views are my own as chair of the SEC, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my fellow chairs or the staff or my fellow commissioners. But I want to welcome the public also who's listening in, and thank you for tuning in as we celebrate the 90th anniversary of this agency. It was in the depths of the Great Depression. President Roosevelt worked with Congress to enact the Securities and Exchange Act of '34, creating the SEC and making this day, June 6th, our official birthday. It's just one of a handful of the original securities laws, but taken together, and they actually started in '33, but taken together, these laws and this agency, I think, put our markets on a path in which investors and issuers alike can have trust in the markets. And that was at its core. It was like trust in the markets. And these time-tested laws have played an important part in boosting the economic welfare of everyday Americans for 9 straight decades. I think it's also a big part of why we have the leadership we have around the globe, and our capital markets punch above our weight class. 42% of the world's capital markets here in the US. For anyone who doubts the significance of these laws and regulations, just think back to the schemes and frauds throughout the 1920s. They were called the Roaring '20s, but there were a lot of problems, and a lot of hardworking Americans lost their money and then lost their jobs in the Great Depression. Thinking about it in terms of sports, if you wish, imagine what would happen to teams, athletes, and fans without fair competition, without the refs on the field and so forth. The SEC remains the stewards of that trust, efficiency, and competition within our markets. And I just want to sort of close with a couple thoughts about 2 letters that were written back in 1934. You're going to hear a little bit from Joel Seligman a little later, and Michael Beschloff and Kathleen Kennedy Townsend on a panel talking about the history of this agency. Of course, we're honored to have numerous former commissioners, but you also hear from chairs Breeden, White, and Shapiro. But I want to read 2 letters, and one was April 12th, 1934. Richard Whitney, who ran the New York Stock Exchange at the time, wrote to Roosevelt that he was, quote, sincerely disturbed as to what may happen if unsound legislation is enacted, end quote. He went on to write about Sam Rayburn's modified bill. Sam Rayburn later was Speaker of the House, but he ran the Commerce Committee and the key committee that the bill went through, this Fletcher-Rayburn bill. And he said, I'm confident that its enactment would be a disaster, end quote. Richard Whitney, April of '34. Roosevelt did not meet with him. He kept asking for meetings, and Roosevelt, I think, let others meet with him. A few months later, FDR received a letter from Felix Frankfurter, one of his key advisors on the writing of these laws, but also a key advisor and later became a Supreme Court justice. And Frankfurter wrote regarding the effective administration of the SEC, this new administration, and he said, quote, you will need administrators, end quote, quote, who have stamina and do not weary of the fight, who are moved neither by blandishment nor fears, who, in a word, unite public zeal with unusual capacity, end quote. Felix Frankfurter. Well, I think 90 years later, thousands of SEC staff, over 100 commissioners since that founding. I think there's been about 100 of us that have had this great honor. 30, I guess, 3 chairs have answered Frankfurter's call. I really think so. Thousands and thousands of public servants I thank all of current 5,000 and all that have come previously for their service. I thank them for their rectitude, and contrary to Richard Whitney's belief, the SEC has made its work for investors and issuers over this $110 trillion market we oversee today. And I thank you. We're going to hear from my fellow commissioners that are going to be on the cameras. And then if my three former chairs come up in a few minutes, and then we're going to have our first panel discussion. But it's over to Hester Peirce, I think.
Thank you, Chair Gensler. It's an honor to be celebrating the SEC's birthday. And I'd say, as with any 90-year-old birthday celebration, some of the people are going to be out on the sick list. That's me today. So I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I do want to give the disclaimer that Chair Gensler gave, which is these views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. It is a real honor to regulate the best capital markets in the world, and it's an honor to do so with people who care so much about those capital markets. We've protected countless investors, facilitated the capital flows needed to support a robust economy, held bad actors accountable, and promoted market integrity. In our 90 years, our nation has weathered recessions, financial crises, and attacks on our liberty. Throughout those dark times, the SEC has played a critical role in helping restore our markets and investor confidence. I think milestone anniversaries are a good time to recommit ourselves to working hard and reflect on what we can do better. We should follow the lead of a 90-year-old friend of mine. His mind is sharp as a tack. He's wise and still studying and learning every day. His posture is straight as an arrow. He spends an hour a day on the Stairmaster to the dismay of his much younger fellow gym compatriot. And he strives to live better each day than he did the last. How can we exhibit this similar vivacity at our 90 years? We can stop fearing market dynamics, competition, technology, and innovation. We can be as willing to acknowledge regulatory failures as we are to identify market failures. We can stick to our statutory mandates, protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitating capital formation. We can resist the temptation to regulate outside our statutory boundaries. We can treasure our staff of dedicated, hardworking, specialized, and knowledgeable public servants by empowering them to think through difficult legal questions about the application of securities laws to new circumstances. We can stop using enforcement as a substitute for considered regulation. We can savor the wonder of the capital markets' power to transform people's lives and build a prosperous economy. We can recommit ourselves to good administrative process in our rulemaking, our exams, and our enforcement actions. We could frequently, seriously, and diligently seek input from investors, industry, and other interested parties. We can embrace a culture of humility, intellectual curiosity, and respect for divergent views. We can remember how immensely privileged we are to serve the American people. I look forward in the short term to the panels ahead, in the medium term to continuing to work with my colleagues on these important issues, and in the long term to a 100-year celebration in which we will be an even better regulator than we are at 90. Thank you.
Hello. Today we celebrate the 90th anniversary of the passage of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which established the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's easy to forget now, nearly a century later, what a triumph it was that the agency was even created. It was an extraordinary fight, wrote Felix Frankfurter, who would soon be appointed Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He further went on to say, and considering the forces and resources against it, it was an extraordinary achievement for decency and for honor, and for the salvage of those very institutions that were blamed for causing the crash of 1929. Over the intervening years, our agency has faced challenges, large and small, and it has had remarkable achievements. Within the first years of its existence, it won a Supreme Court case defending the constitutionality of certain registration provisions and, implicitly, the entire securities regulatory system. It has developed the law of insider trading, helping to evolve from a common law action of uncertain utility to one of the fundamental building blocks of a fair market. It has fought to make sunlight, full and fair disclosure, a cornerstone of our regulatory regime, in line with President Roosevelt's intent that, quote, no essentially important element attending the issue shall be concealed from the buying public, close quote. Through it all has been one constant: the hardworking staff through whom the agency functions. Your efforts and the efforts of your predecessors have allowed generations of Americans, hundreds of millions of people, to trust that the securities markets are fundamentally fair and they are safe to put hard-earned dollars for retirement, for your family's education, for your future. This capital, in turn, has financed all manner of businesses and allowed our economy to thrive. Thank you to everyone on the staff who has joined us today to celebrate. Thank you to those who could not join because they're in court litigating to protect investors, or in their offices reviewing filings, or doing any other of the myriad important work that you do every day. And thank you to the tens of thousands of staff members, past and present, who have dedicated their careers to the agency since its founding. Your dedication to the mission is profound and enduring. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Today we commemorate the 90th anniversary of the Securities and Exchange Act, and with it, the founding of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I am pleased to celebrate this moment with my fellow colleagues at the Boston Regional Office. The Exchange Act, along with the Securities Act of 1933, provided the foundation of the laws governing our capital markets. Based on the concept of a disclosure-based, merit-neutral regulatory framework, these laws have facilitated tremendous economic growth, jobs creation, and innovation for the American economy over the past 90 years. It is a period mirrored by our country's rise to become an economic superpower, and that is not by mere coincidence. Like any organization, the Commission is merely a legal vessel that exists only on paper. What breathes life into the Commission is its people and its culture. Today, we celebrate the dedicated public servants who have made this agency what it is over the past 9 decades. We owe a debt of gratitude to every person who has served before us. It is an honor to have Chairman Breeden, Chair Shapiro, and Chair White here this afternoon to represent those predecessors. Turning back to the 1930s, our country faced enormous challenges. The market crash of 1929 had shaken the public's confidence in the markets, and our economy suffered. At this time in history, Congress had a choice. A number of states had already adopted securities laws that were referred to as blue sky laws. Indeed, before I joined the Commission in 2006, I was a regulator with the California Department of Corporations, which was created by the California legislature in 1913 to oversee the offer and sale of securities. Rather than adopting the merit-based blue sky laws that many states had implemented, including California, instead Congress opted to implement a disclosure-based regime. It was a fortuitous choice, made long before widespread discussion of the efficient markets hypothesis, and laid the foundation for the economic growth that followed. By emphasizing transparency and accountability, the Commission laid the groundwork for capital markets that thrive on the free flow of information. Investors were empowered to make informed decisions themselves, while the SEC facilitated an environment of credible information and market integrity. This approach has been a fundamental reason why our markets have become the envy of the world. In September 1970, Chairman Hamer Budge expressed these points succinctly. Investors, he said, both large and small, can invest in our markets with the assurance that market forces, rather than manipulative forces, are determining the day-to-day prices which they pay and receive for their securities. It is vital to our economic growth and development that our securities markets continue to operate freely and fairly of artificial restraints. I've been lucky, incredibly lucky, to have been part of the Commission for the past 18 years, first as part of its staff and now as a commissioner. There are others at the commission who have been here much longer than that. It has been a privilege to serve with you. Our history and commitment for the past 90 years should make each of you proud. However, we cannot rest on our laurels. Just as the drafters of the Exchange Act likely would not have envisioned a world where an investor could buy and sell baskets of securities on a tiny mobile communications device from anywhere in the country, we need to think about how the SEC fulfills its mission of protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitating capital formation in an ever-evolving technological environment. Today, let us reaffirm our commitment to the principles upon which this agency was founded. I look forward to working with you as we continue that journey.
Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to all of you. We proudly mark the Commission's 9 decades of effective service to America's investing public. During the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt sought to protect the public against the rampant investment frauds of the 1920s and worked with Congress to establish this great commission. It wasn't always popular. There was significant Wall Street opposition to the 34 Act that created the commission. I want to tell you a story about this opposition. Back in 2002, I served as a House Financial Services Committee staffer. Congressman Barney Frank asked me to put together a legislative history of the 34 Act. I included lots of quotes from prominent business leaders of the era who worried that the act would do much harm to our capital markets. If you followed Congressman Frank's career in Congress, you would know that he had a unique talent for clever debate and for making a point with a bit of showmanship and wit. So you might imagine what happened next. At a meeting of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act Conference Committee, Congressman Frank quoted business leaders worried about the prospect of stepped-up market oversight. But he didn't tell everyone right away that he was quoting business leaders from the 1930s. Instead, he surprised them with the fact that the gloom and doom scenarios of the 1930s sounded very similar to those being voiced in the 2000s. The federal securities laws have paid off and have made it possible for the Commission to become one of the great success stories in government. The Commission undertakes difficult, often complicated, and sometimes unpopular work. But this work has benefited the investing public, our capital markets, and our country for the 9 decades being celebrated today. And it's turned out to be an excellent deal for the taxpayers. With its $2 billion budget paid for by fees assessed on market participants, it is budget neutral. In 2022, the Commission recovered 3 times the size of its budget in enforcement actions alone, the most in history. Where possible, we return those funds to wronged investors. To me, this is government at its best, making things right for people who are harmed by the misconduct of others, the people we have a duty to serve and to protect. And we cannot let up. Congress gave the Commission powerful and effective authorities that are applied fairly and responsibly, that are designed to serve the public interest above all. The existing body of securities law is the law of the land. We have an obligation to follow it and to enforce it without fear or favor. This framework has succeeded in protecting investors against all forms of market misconduct. It isn't broken and it hasn't failed. So there's no good reason to weaken it. I'm unable to be there in person today because of another celebration near and dear to my heart, my son Diego's high school graduation. I'm proud of his accomplishment. As he makes decisions about his future, I'm also proud to be able to tell him that what we do here and what is being celebrated today is all about his financial future and that of the millions of his peers across our country. What a special way to mark this day. Chair Gary Gensler has convened impressive panels of former SEC chairs and renowned scholars. I've learned so much from Gary about the Commission's history and about our capital markets. What better way to honor his pursuit of excellence in fulfilling our mission than through this celebration? And what a privilege to also be joined by former Maryland Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who recently advised the U.S. Labor Secretary on retirement security matters. With a direct family connection to the Commission's first chair, Joseph Kennedy, she brings a unique perspective to the discussion today. Thank you for the opportunity to offer a few thoughts, and I wish you all the best.
I want to thank all of my fellow commissioners for their words of wisdom and thinking about our 90th. And now it's my honor to be joined by three individuals that served their nation so well, but had this role of chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission before. I'm so honored to have it. Richard Breeden, number 24. We could have gotten hats. But served under President George Herbert Walker Bush. Mary Shapiro, 29. 29. Chair under President Obama. And then Mary Jo White, number 31.
I think so. Third woman chair, just a.
So third.
Yes, right. So third chair.
Third/31.
Right.
Who also served under President Obama. So I just want to thank you all, and I'm going to try. This will be lively, and I'm sure it will go not according to script. But if I can ask each of you just to comment on what you think the greatest era that was not your own. So Richard, you can't take your term, but 90 years, you can pick anything you want.
Well, at the outset, I'm sure I speak for all three of us. We're delighted to be back. It's an honor to share this anniversary with you and to share the celebration of such a unique agency, and incredible staff, and a wonderful, wonderful history. I think it's hard to name any single era as better than any other, because in each era, the commission has risen to whatever the challenges are from the external world. And that's a function of economics and technology and communications and war and peace and a lot of things. For me, the most, at least in the era before I became chairman, the most significant era was probably beginning with Ray Garrett, who in 1975 deregulated commissions on stock trading. And up until then, the trading of stocks in New York was a little bit like trading commodities in the movie Trading Places. I mean, it was a very much a unique and small focused system. And the commission in that era presided over breaking that apart and breaking up the club and beginning to open up capital markets to America in a way that wasn't what we have in the mass scale today, but was the beginning. I would say along in that era, also the first, and this was under Bill Casey in 1973, the first trading of options on the CBOE, which made it possible down the road for structured products, derivatives, hedging, things, all of the much more sophisticated products than just buying and selling an individual stock. And Harold Williams, who carried on a number of those initiatives and his own. And then really pivotally, John Shadd, who served for 7 years under Ronald Reagan, and who, among other things, was the true godfather of Edgar. And brought, and it's hard to imagine today, it's hard to imagine that before Edgar, to find out information about public companies or about tender offers, you had to send someone to a public library.
That's the kindest thing said about Edgar in a century.
So Edgar and shelf registration. And so that era, you had 30 or 40 years of relatively static initial trading, and then this intellectual outburst that helped broaden the markets well beyond and put us on a path to a democratized market that hundreds of millions of people around the world can participate in that we have today.
Mary?
Thanks. Well, that was a fantastic answer, and I can't even come close. And so I think it's a great question to ask Joel Seligman in the next panel, who's such a historian of the SEC. But I would have to say probably the 1930s, obviously when the agency was created, the seminal laws were passed, the rule book was starting to be filled out and began to take shape. But what I really think, more than any one era, is that what this agency does so well is that it deals with crises exceptionally well. So what I mean is that crossing multiple eras, you see the SEC step up to the plate time and time again when something goes wrong, largely outside of its control, largely driven by much more external forces, and then fortifying the regulatory system in response to whatever that crisis is. So if you think about the Enron failure, we had Sarbanes-Oxley as a response and oversight of the accounting profession for the first time. Or we had the market reforms after the flash crash in 2010, or the recent, as Gary calls them, tremors in the Treasury market and the regulatory
Tremors, jitters, oopsies.
Exactly, and the regulatory response that's coming to that. So I think the agency, era after era after era, is really good at dealing with the problems quickly, comprehensively, and effectively. And I think more than picking any one time, I would say that.
I guess I would say, and it's been alluded to by Chair Gensler and the commissioners and everyone really, is perhaps the founding era under Joseph Kennedy. I mean, writing a statute doesn't do it. You have to make the agency work, survive, have credibility. And then frankly, every other era that followed that maintained the SEC, as a very strong, agency, and sometimes against really high odds, all odds. I think, Mary, you get a particular shout out in that regard for your tenure following the financial crisis and Bernie Madoff and, saving the agency in many ways. And so I would say that if I were to single out, which I don't, maybe I would single out an era that I think was particularly productive. I mean, there are many, but it would probably be Harvey Pitts, the late Harvey Pitts era, when Sarbanes-Oxley, came into being after Enron, after WorldCom, and the SEC was really charged with implementing, I think, regulations that really affected a sea change in financial reporting. Whether be 404B and internal controls, the PCOB was really established, then as well, certifications of financial statements, by the CEOs and the CFOs. A lot good happened there. And the agency was given, I think, 180 days in Congress's wisdom, to do at least most of the, most important ones. And they actually got that done. I think the week before Super Bowl Sunday, I mean, the act passed in, I think, July 30 of, 2002. And I think by January 15, 2003, those had actually, been done. I mean, as Mary and I know, painfully, I guess we got about 100 under Dodd-Frank Act. I think, Gary, you still have a couple to do.
It was 120, but you left us 10.
Who's counting?
I mean,
who's counting? Now, well, we could do that, but that would take our whole panel. But and like, in fairness, I think Sarbanes-Oxley was much more targeted to what the problems were that had emerged. Some of the Dodd-Frank provisions very important. Some of them, a little in different categories, I think. But I think I would. I'm trying to be, diplomatic here as much as I possibly can.
You're not planning to go through Senate confirmation again.
I don't know, but I have gone through 3 times, right? So I would say, the late Harvey Pitts era is the one I think about.
No, it's really great. And by the way, that founding era also defended this SEC in front of the Supreme Court and the constitutionality as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was Kennedy and Landis and Douglas and Frank. Before I took this job, I called by, I think then, 9 living predecessors. Harvey, we've lost since then. Great loss. But I don't have time to repeat everything that they all said to me before I took the job. But Richard, you said something that really stuck, if I may. And I don't know if you recall it, but I'm still to this day wondering what you actually meant. And here it was. He said, Gary, at one point we had a lovely conversation and we had never, I think, physically met before that. But he said, remember, every day as chair is another day closer to you becoming a member of the former Chairs Club. every day. So, you know, you can take that different ways about the honor and privilege of the job, but you're here today. So what did you mean?
Yeah, it's not usually so hard to figure me out. No, it was, I think I had the great privilege of serving in the White House under the first George Bush, before coming here. And that was a time of immense financial trauma.
And for those who are listening, Richard was like 31 and he goes into the White House and he becomes an assistant to
the president.
You know, the president and an advisor to the vice president. So he's wired in that White House.
But we dealt with one of the huge financial crises of the time, which was the savings and loan crisis, which could have turned into the banking holiday of 1933. I mean, we had the Maryland state-chartered savings and loans, the fund go bankrupt, people in this area sitting in lawn chairs out in front of savings and loans. And in Ohio, the same thing. There were $1.5 trillion of insured deposits and $3 billion of insurance reserves and insolvencies everywhere you looked. And with vigorous action, leadership by the president and very strong bipartisan majorities in the Congress, we passed a law in about 9 months, FIREA, that we're still bringing prosecutions under, and passed a law, refinanced the system, and put stability back in the financial markets, but without eliminating competition and so on. Anyway, that was a very searing experience for me. And among other things, I think my prior government service had taught me to just don't put off to tomorrow what you can do today, because you have a window when you serve here to do good, and hopefully to do immense good. I mean, you actually, it's an awesome thing to think that you can benefit hundreds of millions of people that you'll never meet, but help make their lives better. And every day is a privilege, but is also a wasting asset. And so it was just...
I'm glad to hear that's what you meant, and it wasn't that, you know, you can't wait now. No, I couldn't agree with you more. It's such a remarkable privilege to be here, and you can affect hundreds of millions of people's lives for decades to come. But also time is the most scarce resource in policymaking and politics as well at that time. But Mary,
because it's never linear, right? When you do a rule or you do an enforcement case, it almost never goes from start to finish in a straight line. And so you arrive and you think, I've got all the time in the world. I've got 4 years, I've got 6 years, whatever I have in my term. I can get so much done. And it flies by. And your weeks are marked by Thursday afternoon enforcement meetings and Tuesday morning public meetings. And before you know it, the time is gone. And so you shouldn't waste even a minute of it. I agree with that.
Mary, you of course had the honor to also chair another agency. Ray Garrett, who was mentioned earlier, was the chair when Congress was considering whether there'd be 2 market regulators or 1 market regulator. Ray had other things on his mind, and he said to the White House, I'm told, it's fine, it could be 2 market regulators. But what do you think separates us, sets us apart from other regulators? And I'm not asking you to compare us to the CFTC. I'm just saying, you know, when you think of the SEC, whether they're regulated the environment, regulate securities markets overseas, what sets us apart?
I actually think what sets us apart is enforcement. If you look at, and this was an issue we talked about a lot during Richard's tenure, the way prudential regulators approach violations by their institutions compared
don't approach
them, compared to the way we do at the SEC, it's worlds different. And I think the SEC is really effective at deploying enforcement as a complement to rule writing or examination. And without that, you get a rule book that's a paperweight. Nobody pays attention to it. Nobody cares about it. But it is the threat of enforcement and of sanctions that are meaningful, that really enforce compliance with the rules. And we wouldn't enact the rules if we didn't think they were important to protect investors or the stability of the financial system. So I really think that focus on enforcement is the thing that makes us unique, particularly as compared to prudential regulators, maybe a little less so compared to the CFTC.
We're also the agency, the only one, right? That's at least core mission is to protect investors. You know, the other regulators are, you know, deposits or customers or consumers, you know, and all those issues. And you've heard people talk about it this morning. I mean, college education, retirement, you know, things that are near and dear to, you know, everyday citizens. And and the other thing I would say is, I've always said and still say, is the independence that is maintained, you know, by the agency and its staff. And I'm not saying that because hopefully staff is in the room. I mean, it is just a very special, expertized staff, you know, dedicated to the mission.
We were talking about this upstairs. Did you ever feel that you had the White House or Justice or Treasury? I mean, you can say it now, you know.
There's much I can say now.
Challenge your independence.
You told me not to. So, no, I'm kidding. No, look, I mean, on the independence issue, I don't mean to make a light of it at all, because it's frankly one of the main reasons I agreed to be honored to be the chair and be nominated and appointed as the chair. And I was telling the story of when I was announced as the nominee to succeed Mary and Elise. President Obama said, "Congratulations, Mary Jo. I'll speak to you again in 4 years when we're both out of office," because he was honoring that independence of the agency. And he did. And, you know, and I think that's critical, and it shows respect for the entire agency.
I think there were only two real moments for me. One was, and Meredith Cross is here and she'll remember this, when the White House called a little upset about proxy access because they'd heard from lots of businesses that were really unhappy. The other was when the first draft of Dodd-Frank eliminated the SEC, and they had the decency to call me over to Treasury to tell me they were eliminating the SEC. Of course, we fought back against that, and it didn't.
No turf issues in this town at all, right? Yeah,
it didn't come to pass, but for the most part, the Obama
Mary.
White House
right,
stayed
exactly,
out.
exactly.
We were not interfered with, honestly, in any way. We did what we
Have
thought
you
was
found who
right.
put that in there? Have you ever tracked that down,
No,
actually?
no.
Yeah, okay.
But Richard, you were in the White House 8 years. You were like a core key advisor to President Bush, and they left you alone? Or maybe they left you alone because they trusted you.
Well, they certainly left me alone. We did have issues that occasionally would attract White House attention. It wasn't proxy access that you guys were struggling with, but Mary was on the commission when we rewrote the proxy rules. And it was the first major overhaul that had been done in, 30 years or forever. And included in that was a really radical notion that grants of executive compensation with equity in the company, equity awards, should be valued and should be disclosed. And needless to say, the Business Roundtable was fiercely opposed to that. I only met Jack Welch 3 times, and all 3 times it was when he came to my office to tell me that stock options had 0 value. So why should we disclose them? And I said, well, drop them off with my secretary if they have no value. I can't accept it if it has value, but if
it has no value, it's fair game, right?
Leave some behind. And so there were calls. The Treasury tried to express those concerns to make sure we were aware of the Roundtable's views, and we assured them we were. But that was the end of it. And we had when Mary and I were on the commission together, we had a huge fight over German companies wanting to access the U.S. market, but wanting to use in their disclosure documents German accounting rather than American accounting, and to not provide, which you were able to do as long as you gave a Rosetta Stone so that people could compare. And that went all the way up to the Chancellor of Germany speaking to the President of the United States, and the President just said that as important as the relationship with Germany was, that it was not something the White House could get involved in, and he left us alone to decide it.
Yeah, and I will say they've different storylines, everything they've done so with us, and like that negotiation that we did with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. I see some of its members here. Former Commissioner Stein knows. all our negotiations with China, they did the same thing. They pointed them over to us and the PCOB. Mary Jo, how did you think through that? We're an enforcement agency, we're a policymaking agency, we have market oversight. How did you balance those? And particularly, you came from a really distinguished career, as a tough enforcement lawyer.
Yeah, no, look,
Is that all right that I said that?
yes, that's good. That's
don't
fine.
use that in court against us.
Now I'm
that
a
I
vigorous,
gave
but
that
whatever.
compliment.
No, look, I think the word you use that's the most important there, I think, is to balance, those functions. I mean, whether it's oversight, it's the policy divisions and the rulemaking and the enforcement. Enforcement, as Mary said, is it doesn't do any good to have rules unless you have strong enforcement. That was my background, enforcement, and I had a fairly broad knowledge of the securities laws across other spaces, maybe the corp fin spaces particularly. But every chair comes with certain expertises and not others, and should approach all of those functions with humility first of all, and make sure that you have experts to rely on in all of them. I think for example, one area I did not come with deep expertise in was at the asset management industry, and that was extremely important during my tenure. Both we modernized how we regulate, given the size and importance, of the asset managers, and FSOC, which does bring together the executive agencies and the independent agencies, as you know, that should asset managers or some of them be designated as SIFIs. So you had to come up those curves, but I think the thrust of your question is really, you do need to balance those things. I probably spent most of my time, on the oversight and the policy issues, less on enforcement, because you put in good people in the staff as the head of all those divisions and rely on them. But enforcement in particular was something I could do more quickly, I think. But if we get out of balance at the commission, I mean, there's always a criticism of, are you regulating by enforcement? And sometimes that criticism perhaps is justified. Very often it's just a complaint about strong enforcement. But it's important that we not lose sight of, we are the regulator that wants to make those we regulate be able to comply with the rules we think are so important. And that's not just enforcement. So you've got to keep that in balance.
Yeah, I'd say one thing. One of the great chairs, and it has the biggest portrait in our closed commission room, is Manny Cohen, from the 1960s. And he started to lay out insider trading, an approach, and Richard, you said this too, an approach to how to address insider trading, and that was through enforcement. It was not writing a rule. So there are times that's an appropriate way to take an important investor protection right to the courts.
Well, and Joel can maybe fill this in, but one of the questions I got in my confirmation hearings was there had been an effort in which Harvey Pitt, bless his soul, had been very actively involved.
Harvey was the general counsel.
To consider whether insider trading should be codified by statute. And
that's still a current issue, obviously.
To define it. And so it goes back that far and has continued. And there were very well-meaning people who were in support of that. I was quite against it because my view is you don't draw a roadmap for the crooks as to what they can do and what they can't do. Let them worry about whether they took one step too far and preserve.
And that is an enforcement success story, I think, for the
preserve
commission.
The flexibility to case by case, step by step, look at the markets, look at the facts, and make a reasoned decision rather than be trying to have the Code Napoleon of insider trading. And I think the commission, it's only one of many, many cases where the commission has proceeded in a deliberative way, has built its own jurisprudence, has tackled problems as they are emerging, and much more effectively than could be done if you waited to do a mass regulation that would be the be-all and end-all.
Mary, you testified a lot when you were in the job.
50 times.
Oh,
I had the
55.
honor to go up
Did you
with you.
really?
Yeah.
What, how many did you do?
14. You
55.
can draw your conclusions. I don't
Wait. 48, 55. What's your number?
14.
Oh, 14.
14.
14.
50.
50.
55.
Oh.
And I wouldn't have had to do all of those, Gary, if you hadn't agreed to testify before committees not of jurisdiction of the CFTC. Once you did that, then they called me and I couldn't say no because you were.
So
Now you see why we're here today, right?
I
And
testified when I was over
about it.
when I was over at our sister sibling agency.
blame you.
I testified 54 times, and maybe half of them were with Mary there, and we'd go in and Mary would lay out all of her. She had these little 3x5 cards with all her notes. I hope
Yeah.
they're government records,
I
Mary.
prepared
I hope-
excessively.
But all those little note cards that you had, and I remember some of them said things like, oh no, I won't say the building, the procurement on this, or just all these issues. My question is,
You clearly blew him away with that because I did testify once. We overlapped a bit. And you said, thank God you don't have those note cards here. It's so intimidating. You remember that?
yeah. Well, one of the note cards actually said pornography right at the top.
That was an issue, unfortunately.
Yeah, of course.
Some of
yes,
you will recall
yeah,
that. But we had a
That's
deal.
public information.
We had a deal with the Banking Committee and House Financial Services that if they called me to testify, I would always go. But if it was a committee other than those two that did not have jurisdiction directly over the agency, a commissioner could go or a senior staff member could go until Gary went to any hearing he was invited to, and it destroyed our deal.
I'm sorry I broke your deal. But any thoughts on working with Congress?
I don't envy you working with Congress in these really polarized times. It's quite different. For me, coming out of Dodd-Frank and really coming out of the financial crisis, there was broad acceptance on Capitol Hill that we needed to do things. And while everybody might not have agreed about everything, the general thrust was, let's get this law passed. Let's deal with these issues. And that made it a lot easier. I think that you'll never make everybody happy on Capitol Hill. Congress has an incredibly important role to play, and that has to be recognized. And I think the real answer to success in that relationship is a lot of transparency and hyper responsiveness. When they want documents, you provide documents. When they want you to testify, you testify. You walk the halls and you make sure that what you've done, that they're concerned about, whether it's a rulemaking or an interpretation or an enforcement approach, that you've done what you believe to be the right thing so you can always defend it. And that you have an ironclad process around how you got to the position that you've developed. So notice and comment rulemaking, robust economic analysis, explaining a narrative about why this is important and why this matters, soliciting input from the people who always comment and know how to find the agency, and you solicit input maybe from those who don't have a tendency to just show up at the
So I'm going to have a
SEC.
little fun. Richard, did you really drive a sports car to work, and was it red?
I did. It was a red Porsche 944. And unfortunately,
And what was the license plate?
one RCB1 because RCB had already been taken. But there's a story about that car,
And
but
he was
I'll pass.
39
It's,
at the time.
it was really a good car.
I don't think that's age-related,
But
that part.
in those
Do
days,
you drive a
before-
little red
I'm
sports
not,
car?
not here. No. not- I have a sports car. It's not red, though.
the building was unsecure back then. This is long before a lot of the terrorist incidents happened around the world, but our parking garage was, I tried to get control of it for the agency. I wanted our people to be able to park it, but it had been leased out. And so you had to, for the highest bidder, and camera crews would go down in the parking lot and would chase you around. The Japanese news stations were very active with that. So courtesy of the Washington Post, everybody knew when my car was coming, knew what color and where to shoot. So yes, I did have.
Yeah. And Mary Jo, what did you find most surprising when you came to the agency?
I think that just how many politicized issues the SEC handles and how much energy, good word to use, Congress devotes to many, many issues, and how that, polarizes also the commission from time to time, makes it hard. I mean, I think I always go back to, I think it was Commissioner Summer who was commissioner, 73 to 76. I think that was the Ray Garrett era too. And what he said is that in his era, right, if somebody saw the commissioners talking together, which, oh, by the way, they could because the Sunshine Act didn't come in until 76, I think, you would not be able to tell who a Democrat was and who a Republican was, that you were just focused on mission, and sometimes, they'd just be different. And that's true, in our eras too, but much less so. So I think, I knew it was, the bureaucracy of Washington I'd experienced even when I was U.S. attorney, but spent a fair amount of time down here. And obviously the political dimension of Washington is known. I'm not naive about that, but just how many were so, politicized and of interest, intense interest to the politicians.
So quick story about Al Summer, who was truly a great, great, great commissioner in our history. And probably the most terrifying thing I had to confront in my time as chairman was having the SEC host the annual meeting of the IOSCO regulators, which Mary will.
IOSCO is this international organization.
International Organization of Securities Commissioners. And the year before I became chairman, David Ruder had gone, and it was in Venice, and they had parties in the Doge's palace and all these things. And the industry was used to very lavish parties and things. And apparently in other countries, industry funding parties for regulators is okay.
Yeah.
Not so here. And so all these people around the world, all our fellow regulators, were looking forward to coming to the United States and having a grand time, except my budget for entertainment at the time was $1,500.
You should see what it is for this today.
Yeah.
So
we know.
I'm thinking even hot dogs we're not going to be able to cover it for the group, and they were going to come for a week. So we actually, in the end, with the blessing of the General Counsel's office and the Ethics Office, convinced Al Summer to become the head of a foundation, which was created to host the IOSCO annual meeting, and we outsourced it to Al and didn't want to know about what the fundraising was, but we kept it out of the SEC.
And it was a fantastic event.
And there were some wonderful parties.
I don't think it's the statute of limitations
Has
probably
run.
run.
I checked.
Mary, because we're talking about international, the world's capital markets are interconnected, but we're 40% of the world's capital markets. How did you deal with what you were doing here and then dealing with regulators around the globe?
We were in such a crisis when I got here in early 2009 that I didn't actually pay that much attention to international issues as much as I would have liked to. And I really let the staff and Commissioner Casey really run with the IOSCO and the FSB relationships. That said, that was an aberrational time because of the financial crisis and the Madoff fallout that we were dealing with. I really think the SEC's role in organizations like IOSCO and the FSB, and even to some extent in the Basel Committee, is really critical. And I know there's some members of Congress who've expressed concern about participation in multilateral organizations, but we're not ceding authority to foreign governments. We're just working with them and cooperating with them. And if we don't do that, they won't raise their standards to be as high as ours. I still believe we have some of the highest standards in the world. And we disadvantage U.S. businesses that are doing business in other jurisdictions if we don't cooperate and work together. And in the enforcement context, of course, we have to work together because fraud doesn't know any boundaries.
I have found, and I've been
important.
honored to serve in multiple administrations and different jobs, I have found that it's really helpful to learn from international colleagues who are kind of dealing with similar issues. So that's the big plus. I do find occasionally, though, their opinions are they're grounded in their own laws and their own politics, and they have a point of view. It's just like we can't do what they might want us.
Of course,
to do.
and they can't always do what we want
Right.
either. But it doesn't mean there's not an enormous amount of learning and benefit that can come
And
from the
I think the other
relationship.
thing is we have our capital markets are 5 times our banking system. $23 trillion bank system, $120 trillion capital markets. And so a lot of the world's bank regulators and central bankers have, well, we should say, strong views about our capital markets.
But there are many issues you couldn't agree if you wanted to, because because we don't have the authority basically,
Right.
and then
All right, but
then
let's
they
see
don't
if
have
we
our
can agree on
Congress.
this. Mary
But
Jo.
when Richard was chairman, signing MOUs with foreign governments was really important for enforcement cooperation.
Yeah.
Without that ability to share information across borders, major frauds would have gone unprosecuted.
That's huge and easier, right, than
And-
the regulatory
And I
side.
just here again, when we talk about in generalities the staff, but to put some of these things concretely, we struggled with the fact that the markets had internationalized, and if you wanted to be doing insider trading in the United States, you could route trades through the Bahamas and Lebanon and Paris and all kinds of places. And if we couldn't get subpoena authority and cooperation in getting documents and testimony, we'd never be able to bring cases, even cases that were purely domestic, because it was too easy to circumvent. And even before I created the international division, which didn't exist at the time, and made Michael Mann the first head of it. But even before that, Michael, within enforcement, they had realized this problem and had developed this technique called the Memorandum of Understanding that Mary mentioned. And I think I signed 18 of them, but they had been working on them, including getting them done with Britain and Switzerland, that were really tough.
And we
precedents
now
settings.
have what's called a multilateral MOU, which
Took a very
IOSCO
long time, right?
organization.
Yeah,
It's-
to
the
get
whole thing
one
took
of
a
you
long-
probably put that in place.
I don't know if we put it in place, but it was nearly in place when I left. I don't know. Yeah.
But we put in place bilateral ones with all the major trading partners. And it really was a tribute to the staff in combination of enforcement in international affairs and Corp Fin. And they're working with these countries and gaining their trust that America wasn't just the big bully, but that the SEC could help all of them because we had more resources. I remember going in the Netherlands, signing an MOU, and I asked Michael, I said, how many people do they have in their SEC? And he said 8. So, but that counts the 5 commissioners.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of countries, the ability to share information with the SEC and to get the SEC the benefit of our history and knowledge was really critical.
So I want to see if there's agreement here or disagreement, but we're going to start with Mary Jo. What was your favorite holiday party? What division had the favorite holiday party?
This is the most substantive question we're going to deal with. But I'm glad you asked that, because I actually think it really does show the SEC, family, frankly. I mean, people bring their own food to these things. I mean, the ones I remember, I'll start with that. I remember the karaoke. No, I won't take long. Karaoke of the Enforcement Division, the games in Dira, and IM had all of the alumni there as well. My favorite, though, at the end of the day, again, for 4 years, I went to every single one, loved them all. We also did a chair staff party, not the same day, somewhat smaller. The children came, the families came, and it's just they're a great series of parties, I think, that shows just how close the SEC is, really important to the agency. My feet hurt at the end of the day, I will say, from walking around.
Market Reg had the best eggnog.
There you go.
Eggnog.
Somebody had ham that was great too. I forget who that was, but yeah.
I liked them all. I will say before this room existed in 455th Street, we had a much smaller facility. And one of the more interesting parties, not a holiday party I ever went to, was the first year of the International Institute. And we put on a barbecue.
Which is going next week. The International Institute starts next Monday.
Well, it was our device to help. Remember, I was chairman when the Berlin Wall fell. And 300 million people in Eastern Europe and around the world suddenly get catapulted into a market system out of what they'd been in before. So there was this tremendous thirst to understand markets and how do you get one? And could we just send them one in FedEx? And so we did a lot of technical assistance. Bob Strahota and other staff members went to Poland and the Czech Republic and all over to help people understand the give and take of, if you have too much regulation, you will never have a market. It just won't develop. But if you don't have enough regulation, then you will also not have a good market because people will be scared to participate in it. Anyway, we started this institute to try and teach emerging market countries, how does the SEC do what it does? And was wildly successful. But the first time we did it, we had we thought we should have a graduation party. So here we are down in the basement. Somebody on the staff had the idea that everybody should have cowboy hats. And
what's in your idea, though, Richard? No. Might have been.
Let's just leave it to the staff. Anyway, we're having this barbecue down there and listening. You've got the Poles and the Czechs, Mongolians, the South Americans. You have people from all over the world. And the intellectual dialogue about how they could privatize market. I remember the head of the Mongolian agency, which may have been a one-person agency, I don't know, sitting there in his cowboy hat, telling us that he thought the Eastern Europeans were way too slow, that why in Mongolia they had privatized all the yurts in the country in 2 weeks, and while wearing a cowboy hat and chewing on a hot dog.
So let's try this, because I'm going to try to get at least 2 more questions in across the panel. A lot's changing. Technology's rapidly changing. Artificial intelligence, social media, which changes the political world, the news world, but also our markets. How do you view the SEC's role in relation to these, not just the technological change, but how people get information in social media? And we'll just go right down the panel. Mary Jo.
Look, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges the agency faces is keeping up with all that and mastering it. And it is really fast moving. I mean, I think the mission of the SEC is technology neutral, but technology may impact investors in ways that is not neutral. And you have to be constantly able to sort of deal with that.
You didn't have Reddit communities.
No. But all I'm saying is I think you've got to, you do need the requisite expertise to keep up with that and master it and respond to it. I mean, you can't, at least for long, I think, as an agency, just sort of stop it, which you might have the authority to do. You've got to understand it, give guidance, regulate, I think, and, at all times. And it's going to, that's going to be.
Those participants, just if I could say, need to comply with the law,
well,
and not,
again, that goes back to my saying you need to give, help your regulatees or your, enforcees, help in complying as well. But all I'm saying is I think you've got the degree of expertise the commission needs, I think, to do that optimally is a real challenge, going forward.
Mary, and then Richard, and then we've got the closeout question.
Yeah, I think I agree with Mary Jo. I think, society at large is wrestling with these technologies as well. And it's the single biggest challenge that the agencies faces now and will face. And I think some of the tools that exist and you use already will work, and some just won't be up to the task. And I think bringing in the expertise you need is going to be critical.
And Richard, the president you worked for never had an internet website. He didn't, because Bill Clinton didn't have one in '92. The first presidential campaign website was in '96. So, but how would you deal with social media?
We had in my era, we had this quiet rule, and Corp Fin, bless their hearts, had this rule since the 1930s that if you're going to market, then there's a certain period of time you had to be quiet and there couldn't be any news. And if there was news, then your offering got postponed. Well, I can remember the FT publishes some story about some development in Singapore involving an issuer in Europe, and they come to my office saying, we got to stop this. It's violated the quiet rule. And I said, well, at some point, the quiet rule is going to have to evolve to meet global markets. And the staff did figure out a way to do that. We can't stop technology. We can't stop people all over the world from talking, but we sure as heck, I don't care whether somebody commits fraud using a meme or using a Reddit group or out on a street corner.
Fraud is fraud.
Fraud is fraud, and it's this agency's job to catch the crooks and bust them. And we should never, ever shrink from that responsibility.
I like that. Any advice for commissioners and chairs for the next 90 years?
Keep up, right, for the next 90 years. I mean, look, first, know what you're getting in for, and sort of, what you need to do the job well. I do agree you've got to, make the most of your time and do the most good that you can. But chairs should not think of it, look, I'm going to be a chair for 3 or 4 years. It's not about you as the chair. It's about the mission, and you want to leave the agency so that it can continue your work, not to kind of have your own agenda that kind of stops with you. That would be my advice.
I'd say make sure you have people around you who push back on conventional wisdom and don't let you get too comfortable that you know all the answers.
You're up, Richard.
I knew I was going to be up next. I was just wanting to make sure Mary wasn't pausing. Well, thank you for inviting me to come to the 180th celebration. I'll keep you posted whether that's possible. But thank you so much, Chair Gensler, for inviting all 3 of us to this. It's a little presumptuous to try and say what people decades from now should be thinking, facing problems we can't even imagine. I hope, and I really think that what the SEC Historical Society does, and the online library, and the ASICA, and all the groups that work to promote the history and preserve the history of how the Commission has handled problems in the past, will be a huge source, a huge benefit to chairs and commissioners and staff in the future. None of us knew how to handle global offerings until they happened. None of us knew how to handle internet fraud until it happened, and so on. And who knows what AI will bring us, and how we have to evolve the case law to put the first artificial intelligence computer in the slammer for orchestrating a fraud ring. But it's going to have to happen. And so I hope that in all of this we rightly prize enforcement. I see no justification for people who prey on innocent investors and steal their money. And that should always be part of our mission. At the same time, I think we should never forget the importance of the market itself. And I always thought we help democratize the world by spreading information. And no jokes about Edgar. I mean, it really was the beginning of, the idea that on your cell phone you can now get history of stocks and so on, that is, we've made unimaginable progress, and hopefully that will all keep going. But you can't have enforcement if you don't have a market and you don't have investors. And so while we have to focus on preventing fraud and abuse, we also have to continuously focus on making sure that we're a disclosure system, not a merit regulation system, and that we, within the boundaries of rules, that we let free competition and let investors occur and let investors choose.
I thank you, but also promote competition. You mentioned Ray Garrett and that law in 1975 that got rid of fixed commissions. It also made us a competition agency. In 20 different places in 1975, they put competition or lack of competition, those words in the statute. So I think it's part of our remit to always try to promote the fair access to the markets.
it was not one, I totally agree with that. And I think we've all worked to promote that in our own ears. I remember one of the issues we had of the staff having a disagreement on how to handle the licensing or approval of spiders, which was a little product that
And you're not talking the ones that crawl on the ground.
not the ones crawling on the ground. And CorpFin wanted prospectuses delivered before anybody bought one, but it was trading all day, open trading in the market, and Market Reg wanted this and that. And for years it had sat on the shelf, and somebody said, well, we don't know whether the public even wants this. I said, well, we're going to find out, because you guys have got a couple of weeks to work out your differences, but we're going to license it. So we licensed the first ETF. Now, I wouldn't have won the pool of betting that there would be $12 trillion of them traded today back then when we did
Well,
it.
the new frontiers, I mean, the challenge of the new front, whether it's, it's crypto or AI, I mean, you can't underestimate the challenge of that, I think, for the agency. I mean, I guess I was reading a part of at least of Condoleezza Rice's speech recently that she gave at Stanford on AI and regulating it. All of us are really learning about that. All of us, the entire world, I think. And you do need to master very quickly and be prepared to have to, deal with brand new things with the tools you have. And you may not have all the tools. Sorry.
No, I just want to thank all three of you. It's a really remarkable conversation, but that you came in from, you've all got busy lives. I mean, there's life after the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's certainly life after being chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and each of you to lend your time and your energy to this celebration, our 90th
It's really an
celebration.
honor for all of us to be here.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate being
Great.
here.
I'm just hoping that somebody remembers my name in 10 or 20 years, and invites me.
They will. They will.
That's a double-edged sword.
yeah, right, exactly.
As you said, every day as chair is
Yeah,
a day closer to being.
Yeah, right.
I really, you said one day closer to being a former chair.
Something
You'll
to
be
aspire
very
to,
welcome
right?
in the
Yeah.
club. There's no, you don't have to get recommendation letters.
Yeah,
Right?
you don't. Even Mary Jo will
No,
let
it's
me in?
automatic.
Nah, hard to
entrance.
say.
Automatic.
I got it, Mary Jo. Yeah, no, I never worked directly with Richard. I worked very closely with Mary and Mary Jo, and it was always just wonderful. And you were just incredible public servants. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
kind to lend your voice to this, but also I see our next panel, Michael Besloff. I'll introduce the panel as they're coming up or something, and then you can all shake hands with together. But Michael Besloff, who as a 19-year-old was writing about Kennedy and Roosevelt, and has been a remarkable career as a presidential historian.
Thanks.
I think I'm bringing you all up.
You were great.
That was wonderful.
Greetings. I had no idea you were so funny.
Kathleen, are you? Michael, Joel, and Kathleen join us up here. However, here, Michael, Kathleen, Joel, I don't know.
We take guidance of great leadership.
Oh,
Good to see you.
I hate Joel.
Will I knock you off the stage?
So just to introduce our panelist here, I was saying, Michael, who I've known personally because our kids were in school together, so that's how we're just, whatever you want to call it,
Indeed.
soccer dads or
Not
something.
a conflict of interest as far as I can see.
Yeah. Was in college and wrote this book, or started writing this book, Kennedy and Roosevelt, and really has gone on to remarkable heights as a presidential historian, writing about many presidents. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, Kathleen, who has dedicated her life to public service and has done so many things. We first got to know each other when you were Lieutenant Governor of Maryland.
And you were head of the Democratic Party in Maryland.
Yeah, I was. That was quite.
You can see how proud he was of that.
Yeah. Worked with Paul Sarbanes on Sarbanes-Oxley, and he says, "Now, Gary, the next thing I want you to do is treasurer of this Maryland Democratic Party at the time." Yeah.
Can I come in with something?
Sure.
I didn't have a history like this, but Spiro Agnew attended my college graduation. Do I get points for that?
I don't know.
His daughter was my classmate. He was not coming for me. Just want that known.
When I grew up in Maryland, he was my first county executive too.
Yeah, exactly.
So. And then Joel Seligman, who's professor of law at Columbia University.
No, Washington University.
Washington University, sorry. But Joe, oh, that's right. I last saw you at Columbia, but Washington University. But Joe, who, if you haven't read Joel's book, it's like it's the treatise on our history. And you've updated it
a few
times, but over the 20 years, since, it's 30 some years since you wrote it, I think.
Yeah.
So all kind enough to be with us and be part of this today. And I see that I don't have any questions for you, so I'm going to wing it. So I don't have.
Unaccustomed as he is to public speaking.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'll make this work though. No, I don't have anything, but I'll see what this is. No, that's no questions either.
Your agriculture policy.
Yeah. So I'm going to start, Michael, with you because you wrote this book about Kennedy and Roosevelt. What do you think drew them together? And tell us a little bit about the relationship between Kathleen's grandfather and President Roosevelt.
And Kathleen will correct me quickly if I get off track here.
Very hard, as I said. I learned from your book, which I found in my Aunt Jean's library.
Oh, nice.
So it was very nice.
For decades, happily. Well, first of all, it's the 6th of June, 2024. And I don't know if you thought of this way, but today is the 100th anniversary of the Kennedy family in national political life. So could we have a hand for that, regardless of party?
Wait, you say the 100th?
The 100th anniversary. In other words, 100 years ago, or excuse me, 90th. Forgive me. You see why I did not go into
business or finance. As you know, Michael, my Honey Fitz was before that.
He was not a Kennedy.
And Joseph P. Kennedy's father was a delegate in the Massachusetts legislature.
But not national life.
Well.
I thought about this very carefully.
You guys both could have been securities lawyers.
If you know Massachusetts, they had great influence across the country.
True. I'm sticking to 90 years.
All right, but 90 years ago.
It's going to be a really fun panel.
I told you that Kathleen would correct me.
And of course,
good work, Kathleen.
80 years ago today was the battle on Normandy Beach.
Yes.
But you were back to 90 years ago.
Right. Yes, 90 years ago, July 6, 1934. And you were asking how Joe Kennedy came to be SEC chairman the first.
Well, and just that relationship.
Well,
how did that relationship between Kennedy and Roosevelt?
Joseph Kennedy was very successful. He was 45 years old in 1934. His birthday was in September, so he wasn't 46 yet. Right. But he was had been successful in finance, had been successful in the movies. He owned RKO.
Yep.
He was the only person who was head of 3 studios at once.
That I had not known. What were they? We're going to keep on one-upping each other for the next hour.
No,
so
I just lost that one.
Okay. Yeah. FBO was another one. There was another one. I should know this more than you, since I'm.
We're back to Roosevelt and the securities laws.
Sorry. This could go on for a while. I'll keep this concise, I promise. So in 1932, Joe Kennedy was a large political and financial supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. He raised money, but he also did some other things that were very important. For instance, he was quite close to William Randolph Hearst from his days in Los Angeles. And at the convention in 1932, it came down to who Hearst would endorse and throw the delegates he controlled to. And Kennedy called up Hearst and said, I think you should support FDR. So thenceforth, FDR was not only grateful for fundraising help and political help, but really for tipping the nomination in his favor. But to get to the day that we're celebrating, Roosevelt in the New Deal was trying to do three things. And these are words that have been used in retrospect, but not at the time. He wanted to provide relief to those who were suffering. He wanted recovery for the economy, and he wanted reform to make sure that what happened in 1929 and thereafter would never happen again. And in Roosevelt's orderly mind, and Joe Kennedy was a smarter man than FDR. Roosevelt had other talents, but in Roosevelt's mind, he would come into office and first he'd get the people who were suffering, he'd get relief to them, and then he would get the economy on its feet. And then maybe late in his second term, he would get to reform, because that was a more distant goal. And for all sorts of reasons that all of you who have been in national service and politics know, life does not go that way. And so by 1933 in the fall, there were enough reports of malfeasance in the 1920s, the loose regulation of finance and securities by the states, that there was a big demand for an SEC. Joe Kennedy would have much preferred to be Secretary of the Treasury. I'm doing okay so far? And did not become that because Roosevelt knew that he was too shrewd and he was too strong-willed and would not be his vassal. Roosevelt wanted a vassal for all sorts of reasons, which included the fact that the Treasury Department included the Bureau of Internal Revenue, which is another story. But in any case, many people complained when FDR said that Joe Kennedy should be the first chairman, because they said, you know, Joe Kennedy used a lot of these practices that we were trying to outlaw. And FDR said, number one, they were legal in the 1920s. That's the problem. Number two, Kennedy, having known people use them and use them himself, will be the first one to know how to outlaw them and make sure that this does not happen again. Roosevelt said, set a thief to catch a thief. He was not referring to Joe Kennedy as a thief. He was saying the principle, if you want to stop someone who was a thief from doing it again, you find another thief who knows the practices. And I would say that Joe Kennedy at the head of the SEC was one of the best appointments of FDR's 12 years by far, and he did everything that Roosevelt expected.
Kathleen, maybe you could tell us, what did your grandfather share with you, if you can remember, about this agency?
Well, you know, I knew my grandfather when I was very, very young, because, as you may know, he had a stroke when I was about 10 or 11 years old. So I'm going to talk about my grandfather and why I think he was so good as the head of the SEC. One, as Michael pointed out, he knew every trick that was tried on Wall Street. So he knew what had to be regulated. But there are a lot of people who get appointed to jobs that know about what's going on and still don't do anything about it. Right. And so why is it that my grandfather did something about it? And I think a large part of why he cared and to do a good job is because he loved his family. And his first priority in life was to make money and help his family. And I just wanted to show you that on my 5th birthday, he gave me a pony. And I wanted to show you a picture of my grandfather and me riding together. Because every morning at 7 o'clock, this is in Hyannisport, he would get up and go to the stables, which were about 5 miles from Hyannisport. My grandmother would get up and go to church. Different values. And it was really great riding with my grandfather because he loved to ride, he liked to tell stories, and he loved to be with his grandchildren, and he liked to be with us. after we would go riding, at lunchtime, we would usually have two choices. One was to either go sailing with Mummy, which usually consisted of hoping we wouldn't run aground on a sandbar, which we often did, or hit a dock, or going with Grandpa in his boat, the Marlin, which we would never run aground, and it was very pleasant because there was a captain, and we were
And a motor.
and a motor, and we were always well taken care of. So Grandpa liked to have his grandchildren around, and he would enjoy being with us. And the point of this, I'm telling you this, is that when he was head of the SEC, or then later head of the Maritime Commission, or ambassador to England, his primary views was, I want to do well for my family. I want to make sure that I'm leaving a legacy for them. And that meant I had to really do a great job as head of the SEC. I had to make sure that my legacy was something that they would be proud of. In fact, as you know, Michael, because I read it in your book, that I am going to do something that my youngest son, Teddy, who is then 2 years old, would be able to speak about as something that he is proud that I was able to do. And many people, when they think about why they are doing something, they're not thinking about they're doing it for their children to be proud of. They might be doing it for their children to make money for their children or to give money. But he had already done that. And so if you are, or I'm doing it for myself, but if you saw my cousin, Amanda Smith, collected my grandfather's letters. Many of those letters are to his children saying, how are you doing in school? How are you doing today? What's going on? Because he was in Hollywood, or he was in New York, so he wasn't always seeing his children face to face. But he paid so much attention to his children, much more than I think most parents were. And he really didn't like businessmen. In fact, he called and he would tell us this: all businessmen are sons of bitches. So that's
a quote that was quoted by his son when he was president.
Yeah, thank you very much. So he did not really have a lot of respect for other business people. What he'd deal with them, but who he loved was his family. Was that helpful?
No, helpful. Thank you.
It's beautiful.
And beautiful in some ways. But I, as the head of the SEC, could not say the words he might have said.
Well, you could just quote him.
Oh, I see.
Well, actually, this is brief.
I see. I wonder how the Office of General Counsel would deal with me on that. Yeah.
Just for those who don't know, when JFK quoted his father, he said in 1962, my father always told me that businessmen were SOBs, but I never knew until now how right he was. And until now, he was referring to the sudden price hike by U.S. Steel.
I see.
CEO
So,
promised him.
Joe, you studied this agency from its beginning and so forth. To the extent you have a perspective on this, what do you think set this agency apart from the others that Roosevelt set up in the 1930s?
First of all,
Thanks.
happy 90th birthday. What an amazing and frankly unexpected achievement. It has been years, which your last panel well paid homage to, of extraordinary resilience. It keeps reinventing itself, and whether under Bill Carey during the early 60s, Manny Cohen, what you're doing now is remarkable. The homages that the previous three chairs up here reflected are absolutely well said, and it's been because of the staff. I mean, this agency wouldn't be what it is. What made the SEC in the 1930s, quote, the most ably administered agency in Washington was a combination of the greatest crisis. I mean, the stock market crash, the banking crisis was what prompted Congress to act during the first 100 days of Roosevelt. And then against one of the greatest, and as was described by Frankfurter, one of the most vicious lobbies in the history of Washington in 1934. against the act which created the SEC. It is something that sometimes gets lost to history. Roosevelt did not want the SEC to run the securities laws. The Federal Trade Commission had run the Securities Act of 1933. And as Jerome Frank put it, our people are in charge there. To create a new agency was something pushed by industry, pushed by Carter Glass, who was somewhat hostile to any agency that somehow could have an overlap in any way with his beloved Federal Reserve Board. The compromise that was ultimately made was, yes, an SEC came into existence in 1934, much against Roosevelt's opposition, but there was no requirement there be an industry representative on it. And it was supposed to be nonpartisan with no more, as you well know, than 3 members from a political party. What made the SEC the success it was, in part, was the first 3 extraordinary chairs. And Kennedy's role is, in some respects, and I mean this respectfully, dwarfed by the 3rd chair, William O. Douglas, who was probably the single most potent chair of that period. But there'd be no SEC without Kennedy. He was a sharp businessman, as has been reflected. And to give you a sense of what a difference he made, one of the skills he brought to the commission, and it's underappreciated sometimes, was he knew how to start a business. The first thing he had to do was get a budget. The Office of Budget, as it was called at that point, wanted to provide $300,000 for the SEC. The man who was presumably going to be the first SEC chair, Jim Landis, wanted $1.5 million. Kennedy shot for the moon, got $2.3 million. In a very rapid period of time, the agency expanded to 692 employees, which compared to your 5,000 today may not seem like much, was an extraordinary growth.
5,000 is too small.
Yes.
No. Our capital markets are $110 trillion.
Yeah. But the reality was he focused on the greatest crises, the agency said, and he initially employed what he called a cooperative approach. And this meant he got the stock exchanges to register by putting out reasonably inane regulations for them if they would register. They didn't fight him in court. Had they fought him in court, they could have challenged.
All right, I'm gonna keep you tighter because we won't get to
okay.
2 more questions.
All right, in that case, 2 more things he did. One, he ended the capital strike. The securities investment bankers were not listing securities. He busted that, again, by revising the rules. And 2, the thing that he should get greater credit for, he had a remarkable talent for picking great other leaders. So he supported Jim Landis, he supported Bill Douglas, he supported so many others who became the initial senior leaders or commissioners or chairs of the SEC.
Kathleen, you mentioned, and we'll move on from some of these 1930 stories, but you mentioned that your grandfather was the head of the SEC, head of the Maritime Commission, and ambassador to the Court of St. James. But you can tell us now here, this was his favorite, right?
Totally. And this is where he really did the best.
Did he ever tell you really what his favorite was?
Of course he told me. Over and over again. As we sat on the Marlin, I love the SEC.
And in case you ever speak at a history conference there, Kathleen, this is what you should say.
And I say that even though I'm working at the Navy right now.
Yeah.
I can only tell them about the SEC.
No, wait, so you have no sense, probably.
Could I say one thing here?
Sure.
Roosevelt, despite his current reputation, when he came in 1933, he was a big economic conservative and also a snob. He thought that the problem that mainly what had happened in 1929 to the economy was that people who were newly rich came in and did not observe the old values that were exemplified by his close friend from Groton and Harvard, who was the head of the New York Stock Exchange, whose name was Richard Whitney. Anyone know the name of Richard Whitney? Richard Whitney went to prison in the late 1930s. 1937 for embezzling foundations and pension funds that he was in charge of. And that was one of the revelations to Roosevelt that perhaps ethics were not the reserve of a particular class, so that by the end of Roosevelt's first term, Roosevelt, who would have loved to stay on good terms with rich people in America because they would finance his campaign and it would not cause him trouble, because of this SEC, that thought was out the window. And so Kennedy and the SEC managed to move Roosevelt so far that in 1936 in the campaign, Roosevelt spoke at Madison Square Garden, and he said this. And remember, this is someone who was for a balanced budget in 1932, very economically conservative and socially conservative. He said, "I would like to have it said in my first administration that the forces of greed and selfishness, meaning financiers and others, have met their match." And so the throng all screamed, and Roosevelt said, "Wait a minute, I'm not finished." And he said, I won't use my bad FDR imitation, "I'd like to have it said of my second administration that the forces of greed and selfishness have met their master." So this antagonism between business and finance on the one side and FDR on the other side was what Roosevelt hoped not to have happen in 1933, but the SEC and these reforms moved him very much in that direction.
How interesting.
I just want to say about William Douglas, who became, as you know, very, very good friends with our family. My father went in 1954 to Russia with him for about 6 weeks. And in 1960, I don't know, was it 5 or 6, we all went camping with him in Oregon. And somebody pointed out that, or maybe it was when my father was still Attorney General. It was probably weird that the Attorney General would go with the Supreme Court Justice camping for 10 days.
And you were with them.
I was, and I went hiking. One of my favorite memories is it was my father, Justice Douglas, and me went hiking together alone. I don't know, we left everybody else by the river.
Can I say one other thing quickly? You mentioned Jim Landis, who was the second chief of this organization.
And Jim Landis had a long career, and
yeah, it's a very with a pretty sad ending.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Two of Joseph Kennedy's closest friends in this world were Bill Douglas and Jim Landis. Jim Landis worked personally for him for decades and was made by President Kennedy a White House advisor on the Civil Aeronautics Commission, I think. And it became known.
But he was first actually in the White House.
He was, he was
reorganizing the independent regulatory agencies first.
Exactly. Yes, but began with that. And it became known that he had not paid his income taxes from 1956
because of that thing called the
1960.
White House background check in 1961.
Yeah, even. And we think because of a psychological problem, not out of defiance or a criminal nature. And so it was taken to the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. We know that this is a close friend of your family. Should we go ahead with this case? And he said, I hate to do it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he was convicted, and RFK saw to it that he was hospitalized rather than.
Yes. So I say about my father, he did the right thing. You know, it was very tough to send your father's, one of your father's best friends, to prosecute him, which he did do. But then the question is, what should the punishment be? And he said, just because I prosecuted him doesn't mean that I have to punish him when he's in trouble. And I'm not going to be intimidated by people saying that I've been too soft. So it takes guts in both ways, or courage, I would say. Yes, I will prosecute him, but I'm not going to be intimidated into punishing him.
Justice and mercy.
Yeah, justice and mercy. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, true. And by the way, that's a lesson to us all these days as we're considering how much people should get involved in such matters.
Joel, you've written about our whole long history. Do you have a favorite era, or if you were here for the earlier, do you have a favorite holiday party at the SEC?
I'll go to any party I'm invited to.
The previous conversation was the warmest and fuzziest stage conversation I've ever heard about the SEC. That may not be a large number.
We're doing our best to equal it.
Yeah, right. We're trying.
they've all been extraordinary, but the thing that was amazing about the SEC was its start. And, you know, you went from the cooperative policies of Kennedy that worked, the attempt by Landis to spread the mandate to a lot of issues that were left unresolved by the Securities Exchange Act, and ultimately led to things indirectly, such as the National Association of Securities Dealers, questions about do you separate brokers and dealers, questions about how do you create an even more effective enforcement division. And then you had Douglas. And Douglas, you have to understand, was probably the only SEC chair who would regularly make martinis for the president. He was supposedly made the best martinis in Washington, which I don't suspect is a qualification for
I have not been making any martinis for President Biden.
Yeah, but the reality was, I mean, you had a different world. The first three chairs of the SEC regularly went to the White House, had access there in a way that subsequent chairs rarely have ever been as close. Bill Carey in 1961, who was a very successful SEC chair, never met President Kennedy. Basically said, we are a stepchild of the executive and Congress. What made the SEC...
And Richard Breeden, who was here earlier, was a very close advisor to President George Herbert.
Yeah, and that was an exception, to be candid about it. What made the SEC so extraordinary was 1937. And that was the year, as has been alluded to, that the Richard Whitney scandal occurred. You have to understand, Whitney was the all-powerful president and later chair of the New York Stock Exchange. He was next to J.P. Morgan Jr., the most respected man on Wall Street. And to discover that this man, of all individuals you could imagine, was a crook. He had embezzled money from the New York Stock Exchange Gratuity Fund, which provided death benefits, and other foundations, as Michael accurately alluded to. And all of a sudden, it was like the floor fell out from the financial community. And Douglas pursued this case mercilessly. He famously observed, financial and political power rarely diverge, but when they diverge, you have to pounce. And that's what he did. And he pushed through a series of laws. He strengthened the enforcement division. He proposed some things that didn't come into existence then, like a securities depository for securities, but it became the law later. And just to finish it up, that catapulted him to the Supreme Court and almost catapulted him to becoming president. In 1944, he was one of two choices that Roosevelt sent to the floor of the convention.
And Truman offered him in 48.
Truman actually did offer it?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a head fake.
As brilliant as Douglas was at the SEC, he was not great in politics. He figured that Truman was going to lose that year, so why get off the court?
So Michael, when you think about, and you've studied presidents through this whole sweep, I don't know if you've studied them all, but you've tried to. How do you think the different presidents?
I failed.
How do you think the different presidents saw this agency? So yeah, I mean, it was Roosevelt's agency. It wasn't Truman's, of course. But how did presidents and this agency?
I think it's a Rorschach test of each president that we're talking about. You could almost write a political and psychiatric profile of president after president based on what we know about his relationship with the SEC chief, and also, what the history of that relationship was. One thing that Joseph Kennedy also said, he said that the three jobs with the potential to have the greatest abuse of political influence in the United States government, he said, were SEC head, attorney general, and head of the IRS. And he felt that it was particularly important that you had people of integrity and character who had those jobs and were incorruptible.
So just a trivia question. We'll go that if it's no, it's fine. Who's the singing milkman?
The singing milkman?
Yes, at Marwood.
Oh. No, he was chair of the SEC at a certain point under Truman.
Oh, this is a different.
Yeah,
thing.
Harry Truman.
We are at the 90th anniversary of the
Yeah.
SEC. So Harry McDonald.
Yeah, Harry McDonald had a modest relationship to the securities industry, a greater relationship to a dairy. But much more importantly, to become an SEC chair, he had a deep bass voice. And when he called on the White House at the strong suggestion of Senator Vandenberg, Truman said, "Is it true you sing?" And McDonald won the job of the SEC by saying not just yes, and my favorite song is Wagon Wheels, which bizarrely was Harry Truman's favorite song. Harry Truman played Wagon Wheels like 9 times, and Harry McDonald just sang it over and over and over again. And by the end of the evening, Truman looked at McDonald and said, "I can't let you leave Washington." And within a reasonable period of time, he'd been nominated to be chair of the SEC.
So the singing milkman, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school, but there's 5 of us. Your grandfather, Arthur Levitt, Bill Donaldson, the singing milkman, and me.
Yeah.
We're not lawyers.
And only one of you could sing, actually.
Well, I can't speak about the others.
You got there on the merits.
Yeah. Michael, what would Roosevelt say if he were alive today and saw this agency?
He'd be proud of it. He would take more credit probably than he was due, because, just as has been said, FDR did not want this crusading agency in 1934. He thought maybe later on, but he had to win re-election. He had large funders. He didn't want to turn Wall Street against him. And he was still pretty financially conservative in the middle of 1934. Yet, looking at what the SEC has become and how it has made this economy possible, because people do not invest in an economy where there's not a rule of law, and the SEC has made sure that this is an economy with dependable rules and rules of the road, and have some idea of what it will be in the future. It's a little bit like, I hate to say this, that Roosevelt gets a lot of credit for the GI Bill, Bill of Rights, 1944, which allowed a generation returning, I'll say this on the anniversary of D-Day, returning from Europe in 1945 to get educations and loans and other benefits. And yes, Roosevelt was president when the GI Bill was passed, and he wound up supporting it, but it was actually due to a congressman, and Roosevelt was originally against it. So, I think presidents should get all sorts of credit, but the SEC basically emerged almost in spite of FDR. And the reason it happened, I'm not just saying this because Kathleen is here, had almost anyone else been the first chair, it would not have happened. And so that shows that it really, personality really does matter.
Well, it might have still happened, but it
would not have been what it is.
As successful.
Yes, right.
Let me just maybe reframe that a little bit. The SEC was a magnificent accident. Federal securities regulation was not. And we were at the end of a period where you'd had probably the most famous hearings in the history of the United States, the stock exchange practices hearings. And they were an excoriation of Wall Street, including J.P. Morgan, including the banker of banker, who was popularly known as Sunshine Charlie, Charles Mitchell. And Roosevelt tremendously supported this. He was the one who prompted the general counsel of the commission, of the committee, Ferdinand Pecora, to go after the J.P. Morgan house. He wanted federal securities regulation. The agency itself was an aspect of it, but much more importantly was he wanted to bring honesty back to Wall Street, and that's what he campaigned on in 1932. And it was, you know the speeches as well as I do, but whether you deal with the platform, whether you deal with his nomination acceptance, whether you deal with speeches he made along the way, it was an absolute desire to deal with a den of thieves, as he put it, to drive them out of the temple. And this was an attack on Wall Street that was consistent with your history generally. But it all got changed when, in the first 100 days, Congress on its own decided to enact the Securities Act, which Roosevelt had been responsible for drafting. And Roosevelt suddenly realized there was an opportunity to go on to a Securities Exchange Act. And his ultimate dream was two other acts. One that he never got to, a federal incorporation law. The one he did get to, and was the greatest battle during the New Deal period, was the Public Utility Holding Company Act.
Yes, we didn't talk about
And the
that.
Public Utility Holding Company Act was a structural reorganization of an entire industry. It was the largest accomplishment of the SEC for its first 20 years. It involved many constitutional challenges, all of which the SEC won before the Supreme Court.
And-
You're looking at me like I'm
Yeah,
speaking
no,
too
no,
loud.
no. When Richard Breeden was still was chair, they had to still oversee that act, not for Mary
Yeah.
Spiro, Mary Jo White, myself, because about 20 some years ago, those remaining authorities were moved over to other agencies, so we don't have them anymore. You mentioned, did your grandfather mention the Public Utility Holding Company Act?
You know, at the age of 8, I wasn't really into
Yeah, okay, I
public
didn't think-
utilities.
I'm
When they were
curious,
sailing on the
Kevin.
ball.
Kevin,
Yeah, this was your chance.
Kevin, what does this agency mean to your father, your uncles?
Well,
you
I
know,
think-
who were quite in their own right.
I think
Very.
my grandfather's example of really trying to make government work, being honest, being straightforward, was a great example to my uncles and to my aunt Eunice and Jean Ambassador Island. Eunice is starting Special Olympics, and I think that was really a terrific model to have as a parent. And one of the other things that and so they were very, very fortunate to have such a father who wanted to do the right thing, wanted to, as you said, regulate the business, but also revive public enterprise. You know,
Save capitalism.
save capitalism. I don't know if capitalism had ever been very honest. I don't know if that's really part of its being, but he really wanted at least the Securities and Exchange Commission to be honest, so that when you buy a stock, you know that there isn't inside trading, that you can trust what you're getting, you can trust what you're reading, which I have to say, Gary, I think you came in as the commissioner to do just that.
Well, thank
Everything
you.
you've said that, and you really have made yourself a person that says we need to be honest in what we offer. And I really think you've done a fabulous
Well,
job. And
you're-
it's just been wonderful to watch you in action. So I want to thank you for
you're
following
very
that.
kind, but it's these
No, it's
4,000,
Am I
5,000
allowed to
people.
agree?
No, I want to say
Thank
that.
you.
And I think it's really important when you think of the SEC, when you see people like my grandfather, who I really do think set it on a course, that we have in our mind what a good public servant looks like, because it gives us confidence that that can work. And I think you've done it. I think it helped my Uncle Jack and Daddy and Teddy see that that is the star that we can follow. And oftentimes people today say, oh, you know, politics is terrible. And I grew up in a world in which we were always told that politics is an honorable profession. And anytime I hear today that somebody criticizing politics, I come right back and said, it's an honorable profession. And if you don't believe that, it won't be honorable. So I'm really pleasant to be around at times.
You're an honorable.
Pleasant to
Let,
hear.
let me just say this, Kathy, and thank
Yeah.
you for the compliment. I really do think, I mean, it's a matter of how you move policy, this great nation. We have this experiment. It's run 230 some years, and this is their 90th of the SEC. This too is an experiment, you know, and,
Yeah.
and there's many staff and commissioners and
Gary, let me
that are
just
running this great experiment. I agree with that.
let me add one point, and it's particularly salient after a court decision yesterday from the Fifth Circuit. The SEC's challenges never end. as conflicted as the 34 and 35 acts were, we are facing a period in which the Chevron doctrine may fall within a matter of weeks, in which courts are relying on cases like EPA versus West Virginia to, quote, find major questions doctrine to eliminate the ability of agencies to interpret statutes. We are facing statutory interpretations in the Fifth Circuit, which, if it had its way, would have abolished the SEC 5 years ago. It is as hostile a judiciary as we've seen in the history of the agency, and it's not over. And that is a great challenge. The House of Representatives has obviously been a great challenge as well. And one of the things you learn when you study history, whether as Michael has done or I've done or Kathleen has lived it, is everything is in context. What you can achieve as a chair, what you can achieve as an agency is not preordained by a statute. It's preordained by a mix of historical factors. Right now, we should really give a special salute to Gary. This is as tough a period as the SEC has ever faced. And unfortunately, I wish I could say it's going to get easier. It's not. And thank goodness you're here. And thank goodness, as I was reassured by some staffers before I came up, you have no intention of resigning.
But I see, look, you're very kind, but Mary Shapiro and Richard Breeden and Mary Jo White, who were on our panel earlier by Richard, they too, they served in their times, and it's such an honor. And as Richard Breeden said, it's just, you only have so much time, and that's the ultimate gift you have, is what can you do with that time in the context you're in.
Can I add a little thing aside from agreeing totally with what Joel has said? One problem with history is that once we're through something and we look back at it in retrospect, there's a human tendency to assume it was going to happen anyway. And the point I would make here is that in 1934 and thereafter, this agency could have been very easily co-opted by the people it was supposed to regulate.
Yeah.
Could have happened in the 1930s. It could happen in the 2020s. And at least from my reading of history, and this is true of the political situation that we're all in today, the law can only take it so far. It usually depends on people with steel spines who are insisting that the law be executed.
But Michael, you'd agree with me that the study of history is the greatest profession there is. There's more of it every day.
Right. Sometimes more enjoyable than others.
Yes.
Are there any compromises you think that Roosevelt made in that legislation that you think back and you go, oh, geez, it's hasn't come. It was, in hindsight, it wasn't the greatest balance.
I mean, in the context of the times, he pushed about as hard as you could in the 34 Act and then the Public Utilities Holding Company Act. And he lost his supermajorities after the court packing scheme in 37. But in the first 3 acts, he was magnificent. And it's worth appreciating. It wasn't just Roosevelt. It was working with supermajorities in Congress, particularly Sam Rayburn in the House. In terms of, should we have sought merit regulation in the Securities Act of 33? He made the right call. Should we have sought to end the specialist system on the New York Stock Exchange? He sought that. But instead, you ended up with a kind of wishy-washy compromise in Section 10 of the Securities Exchange Act. And you had to, if you were going to get the act enacted. The truth is, laws are not written like law review articles by scholars in their academic cloisters. They're written in the hurly-burly of politics. And at least in those first 3 years, I thought what he did was magnificent.
That's great. You don't have your favorite Christmas party here, too.
I've never, all these years, I wanted to be invited to a holiday party at the SEC, and no one has ever invited me. So if there's anyone here responsible, I'm available in December.
Yeah, I see. Well, there's karaoke at the enforcement party.
Wonderful.
Kathleen, any thoughts for the next 90 years? Any advice? It's the same question I asked the other panel.
Well,
For the next 90 years of staff, commissioners,
I think it's all.
chairs.
I think what I said about my grandfather is character. So when you're choosing somebody, what are their motivations? Why are they doing this? What do they know? And those are the questions I ask when you appoint somebody, and try to ask yourselves.
It's really good advice. I would say this about the people I've come to know and have accepted me as a family here at the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're really here. It's a very mission-driven agency. And we're fortunate for a lot of reasons to have high employee morale. We're generally ranked one of the highest. This year we were third in terms of surveys about people who want to work here. Like of all the
Who was number one, by the way, just out of curiosity?
You know, in our weight class, because we're a mid-sized agency, I think it was GAO.
Well, but I can see that.
But in another weight class, I think it's NASA, and you can see they have rockets. You know, right, you know. But
wasn't insinuating anything.
Yeah. Watch out, NASA. Right. No. I really do think that it's a very mission-driven agency, and we have a lot of professionals at this agency that could work all sorts of other places and make a lot more money. They really could. What the legal profession and the economist and the technologist and the accountants could. But they're here because they're really deeply mission-driven. And I think they live up to Frankfurter's letter. You weren't here yet, but I quoted from Frankfurter's letter to Roosevelt when he talked about the appointments and to make sure that they have basically the rectitude to take on what Wall Street and Wall Street's lawyers would be sending at them.
And who would have known but Frankfurter, right?
Yeah, which is great. But any advice for the next 90 years? Joel?
Choose chairs with steel spines and wonderful ethics.
I wish I had the capacity to think 90 years ahead. My hope is 9 months from now, you'll still be in charge of the agency and continue to do your great job. The one certainty about the SEC, though, and it was really powerfully alluded to in the first panel, whatever you're regulating now, new things are going to be thrown at you constantly. New technologies, greater international adventures, if you will. And the SEC has to continue to be resilient enough to address an ever-expanding list of challenges.
Yeah, I think you're right. We always have to update for the new technologies and the new models. But I'd say one thing that doesn't change, this is about finance. This is about people's money and bearing risk. And you know, since antiquity, way before we were ever set up, when you're dealing with other people's money, you have these questions of trust, you have the questions of conflicts,
right?
And finance tends towards concentration as well. And so I think this was the beauty of this agency and the Roosevelt basic bargain, that the public gets to decide what investments they make, but they need what Roosevelt called complete information. And the first 33 Act he called the Truth and Securities Act. That's what he labeled that. And so I think those things still say, they're kind of evergreens. It's making sure we protect against fraud, manipulation, and you can fundamentally trust the marketplace where you're putting your savings or raising money. And I think that's what this agency does. That's what I wish for the next decades.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I don't know if Richard Breeden said this before I came in, but when Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to reform the Soviet government, he actually came to George H.W. Bush and said, I'd like advice on two things. Number one, how you organize the office of the presidency, what you do about a chief of staff, how you assure that the president of the Soviet Union will get all sorts of good advice. This sounds very antique now, given what has happened there. But the other thing was, he said, how does your security system work.
No kidding.
And
That's
George
so-
H.W. Bush in these summits said, you have to have a rule of law. You have to have something like our SEC to assure investors that if they put money in, that there's a reliable book of rules on which they can depend.
Well, I think Richard already left, but I'm sure if he doesn't know that story,
I'm sure he
he'd love
knows
to.
it, but
So,
one day.
look, I want to thank all three of you. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
There is, I think, some ice cream out there somewhere. But happy birthday to the SEC. I'm supposed to just thank all of our wonderful panelists. I also want to thank the archivist of the United States, Dr. Colleen Shogan, who has allowed us some time with our founding document, which is right there.
Wow.
The lights are dim because that is literally the 34 Act.
There should be two very tough security guards.
So right over there, and we have members of the National Archives and Records Administration here to make sure it leaves in the same condition which it arrived. But for the SEC staff and the audience, we're celebrating with ice cream and professional photographer to capture your moment with the original 34 Act. Like you can stand with it,
Is that cool?
get a picture, but that's because they've allowed us. But please exercise caution. This is I must read this. The lawyers tell me to read this. Please exercise caution with your own devices and keep flash photography and ice cream away from our precious birth certificate. There's added pressure because NARA, this is the Records Administration, founding document is bound in the same book as ours. So they don't want their documents to get any ice cream on it either. But again, thank you so much, Michael, Kathleen, Joel.
Thank you all.
Yeah. You guys were magnificent.